Yeah.
All right, so I have to wait until I turn off my own voice and then I will introduce you.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. And what do you know about agrometeorology? Well, I didn't either until this morning. I didn't actually look it up, only guessing, but I know enough sort of Latin or something to figure out agro must be agricultural and meteorology must have something to do with the climate. Although, even that is kind of a silly word because it ought to have more to do with meteors, but it doesn't.
Well, interesting that you say that because the origin of the word is meteors, things that fall from the sky, and it was Aristotle that coined the term to study weather phenomena, meteorology.
Oh. Okay, so the meteors, was he thinking that the meteors had something to do with the climate?
Well, because meteors is anything that falls from the sky, so
Okay.
it included rain and things that happen up high above.
Oh, all right. Well, that figures. Now, you are a professor of basically of agriculture, right, at the University of Guelph.
Yes.
And I got that far, and then I got interested in the fact that, of course, agriculture contains both plant and animal products. And I assumed that you were a plant person, but then I looked a little farther or further and found that you are into cows or dairy.
Yeah, so agricultural meteorology studies sort of, I always describe it as a two-way street. It studies the impact on climate or weather on agriculture, but also the impact of agriculture on weather and climate. So that the latter is what my area of expertise is. So all the topics that are currently in the news in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, the contribution of agriculture in terms of, how much it's impacting the climate, but also what it can do to help meet some of the goals in terms of removing some carbon from the atmosphere. So that involves both plants and animals. So that's why.
Well, as it happens, that's something I'm fascinated by lately, because and yesterday I had a show with an organic farmer in Northern Ontario, Tony, I can't think of his surname right now, but it'll come back to me, McQuail, and also with a woman in India who's working with the landless people in India about developing better agriculture and so on. And I've been talking to people, one of your colleagues actually, Ralph Martin, about a week ago, about, he's into organic farming.
Yeah.
And I've talked to several other people on this. It really is so important. You don't have to convince me. I'm clear that one of the most important things that we can be doing to try to control the climate change is agriculture. So let's talk about that. And I was interested in finding that you also are interested in the emissions from cows, that you're in the dairy business, so to speak.
Yes.
About a month or maybe 2 months ago, I had a talk show with Frank Mitloehner in Davis, California, who is, he has a very strong point of view. And I would love to hear your point of view about that issue, whether or not we can tolerate and even appreciate the methane cycle that is produced by not just dairy cows, but cattle and beef production and so on. So, and I think I called that show Cows, so maybe yours will be called Dairy Cows.
Well, I mean, my area is quite like Frank is an animal scientist. I'm not an animal scientist. I work sort of at the interface of the surface. What we call the surface is everything that's going on the ground and the atmosphere and the kind of the gases that are exchanged. So that may include animals or include soils and so on. I mean, the reason ruminants produce methane is because they're able to digest sources of carbon that like in grass, like cellulose or lignin, that we are not able to. So they play a really important role in many places in the world in terms of providing livelihood for people, right? Like you probably know of like the value of a cow for an African farmer, subsistence farmer is a huge, it's like a bank, right? Like they put that money into the animal that then gives milk. So that is the important role. Now, we can't get away from the fact that because of that, the rumen, the way the animals digest the grass or the fiber that they're eating, they have to cut, like chew that many times. And as they're doing that, basically burping, methane comes out, right? So it's a carbon source, and many systems that are better managed in terms of nutrition and animal health produce less methane. But we can't get away from the fact that these ruminants do produce methane. So it's a little bit, it's a balance. Like I would never advocate, let's get rid completely of these animals because they have a really important function in the landscape. But if you look at a piece of, like if you look at milk or a piece of meat, those have much higher carbon footprint than some other product. Now we do need to look at the whole life cycle, right? Of what, and there are numbers out there, but often they're also misleading because they may not consider all the impacts, right? So if you are, if you substitute that protein source to soybeans and the soybeans were grown by deforesting the Amazon, you're not that much better off, right? Like, so it's all about sort of trade-offs and balances. And I know I'm kind of circling in my answer, but that's because I'm not an activist. As a scientist, I look at sort of all the aspects. And the other important part that I didn't mention yet is that the recycling of manure, sort of nutrients to soils, either in pasture or in other settings, that really helps with carbon sequestration in the soil, as well as grasslands in general. They are good stores of carbon. So if we are going to get rid of sort of the livestock in the landscape and get rid of the grasslands to plant annual crops, then that is a trade-off that would result in quite a bit of carbon loss, which is not a good thing, right? So we always have to sort of, and it is a livelihood for many farmers in Canada. So the question would be, if we replace all the grassland with like a non-grazed landscape and bushes and trees, that will capture carbon. But then what are these farmers going to do? Are they just going to leave the business and not work in agriculture? Or are they going to become cash crop farmers? Like, are they going to grow soybeans or canola or something that works up the soil? And whenever you do that, you lose a lot of carbon, right? Mm-hmm. So anyway.
Oh, all of those are, I think, extremely important arguments even And one of the, one of the things that Mitloehner points out, and it had not dawned on me, but it's clear that the emission of methane from animals is, it's not different methane, but it's the process is different from mining, so to speak, bringing fossil fuels to the surface that's been hidden for a million years or whatever, and bringing it up and adding it to the atmosphere, because the methane that is produced as part of the animals burping is part of a cycle that is, it goes into the atmosphere, it stays there about 10 years, it gets kind of broken up, it goes, it gets into plants, it's absorbed by plants, grass, then the cow eats the grass and puts it back out again. So if you have the same number of cows eating grass, the same amount of grass forever, you wouldn't have any additional methane, but you could only change the amount of methane in the atmosphere by increasing or decreasing the number of animals that are doing this, right? Okay, that makes sense. That to me makes it somewhat more bearable. But of course, I am an activist, and all my friends are activists. And when I became pretty persuaded by Mitloehner's argument that we would be worse off in some ways if we didn't have these animals, then my friends jump all over me, and including some good scientists who are very concerned about methane and who think that a very substantial part of the methane in the atmosphere is produced by ruminants. What proportion of the methane that's in the atmosphere now would you say is part of this cycle coming in and out of cows or other ruminants?
Yeah, I don't have that number on the top of my head. I actually have worked with methane, but in terms of my measurements, I have worked much more with the other third biogenic gas, which is nitrous oxide. So if we look in agriculture, about half or so of the emissions are in methane form. The other half are in nitrous oxide. So that's laughing gas. And it is part of the nitrogen cycle as opposed to the carbon cycle. But of course, these two are interrelated. And that is due to nitrogen addition in fertilizer form to soils. And any nitrogen, be it in manure form or legume form or synthetic fertilizer, will enter the nitrogen cycle and and produces some nitrous oxide.
Well, so I don't know enough about nitrous oxide. Please educate me. Is this our friend or our enemy?
Well, it's like any of the greenhouse gases, they are a good thing, but if it's too much of a good thing, which a lot of our problems are of pollution are related to that. So nitrogen is a building block of, it's in protein, and you can't really grow crops, or you can grow crops without nitrogen. But it ends up mining the soil, and the plants are quite stunted. So if you don't have enough nitrogen, and particularly for our current yields that are quite high, which is a good thing because agriculture supplies food to many billions on Earth. We need to add this nitrogen to replace what's removed and ends up in waste in cities and can't really be recycled back as promptly as in the old days, right? In the old days when people had their waste right there and would perhaps put it on their fields and had chickens and hogs and so on. that cycle of nitrogen was a lot tighter. Now we've kind of, and this goes back like in the 1800s, where Europe started, like people started concentrating in cities and yields started going down, and they had to go and mine guano off the coast of Peru, because that is a product that is high in nitrogen. So there is even something called the guano wars that happened, some conflict. So these big ships would come and collect guano from these rocks in the ocean and take it back to Europe and use it in agriculture. Then with the event of the Haber-Bosch process, which was really motivated by war and bomb making, these two gentlemen discovered the way of fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere into a product like urea that can, so it's a synthetic fertilizer that can be applied to fields. Now, in organic agriculture, this is not used, right? Synthetic fertilizer. So they really depend on use of legumes and manure, although I've been told that manure can come from other farms that perhaps have used fertilizer. So that's perhaps a little loophole in the system. But anyway, so I'm digressing, but that nitrogen, when applied to soils, enters a microbial process, so similar to methane, which is also generated by microbes. Within the soils, we have bacteria that will, as a byproduct, leak a little bit of N2O. And that will come.
Now, there's where the NTO, that's the nitrous oxide, is that right?
Yes, right.
See, that's where I got into this detour because I don't know, I know about a little bit about nitrogen in fertilizer, but I don't know it as nitrous oxide.
Yes.
So this laughing gas idea.
Yes, it is.
What part of the cycle is it in the form of nitrous oxide as opposed to whatever else it is in fertilizer?
Yeah, so it is a sort of rule of thumb is about 1% of the nitrogen applied leaks out as nitrous oxide. So the amounts are not large, but the impact is big because, well, it's bigger than it sort of punches above its waistline in a way, because nitrous oxide is present at 1,000 times lower concentration than CO2, approximately. So we have CO2 in the order of parts per million. N2O is in parts per billion. So it's much less per amount of air, but its ability to absorb what's called long wave radiation, is about 300 times that of CO2 on a molecule per molecule basis.
Okay,
So
now I've heard that methane is, well, upwards after 28 times as a strong greenhouse gas effect as CO2. But now, are you saying that on that kind of scale, that nitrous oxide would be like 300 times?
Right.
Okay.
But it's present in much less. So in terms of overall impact in warming, it's still behind methane and CO2, because on a molecule per molecule basis, it absorbs more, but then there are much fewer. So it sort of cancels out. But that is a gas that if we resolve the methane problem through eating less ruminant derived products such as meat and milk, then we will be left with about still half of the problem, which is the emissions in the form of nitrous oxide from soils.
Because yesterday, I believe Biden and a bunch of people in Glasgow announced there's a big campaign now to reduce the methane.
Yes.
And of course, it's not just methane from ruminants, but from a number of other sources. Swamps, I think, and rice paddies. And the thing that bothers me most is I've been doing talk shows with people who study the clathrates at the bottom of the Siberian shelf of the Arctic Ocean, and who are worried worse than anything else about the melting permafrost that's holding the methane deposits down, because this stuff is coming up now. And that sounds like it could be that would be the catastrophe, really literally to end all catastrophes for human.
Yeah, these positive feedback effects is particularly like in the natural systems, which we can't control. Those are the things that are really scary in this whole, I mean, there are a lot of scary things in the climate change issue, but another good example is the forest fires, which are not liberating, but like unlocking carbon that's been stored for hundreds of years, and that's all going up in smoke, literally. So yeah, those are now kind of beyond our control, in the sense that we unleash the warming, and so that is so I focus my work on, because it's in agriculture, it's a managed system, right? So there are things we can do to lessen the impact, at least. And there are a lot of co-benefits from the practices that we look at in terms of increasing soil health, which it's a bit of a vague term, but it's basically sort of the characteristics of soil to sustain, in terms of biological, physical, and chemical properties, to sustain life and production. And that is related to water quality, water quantity, resilience of these systems to withstand drought periods or excess water. So in the long term, these practices, we hope, like, they are kind of win-win in the sense of mitigating emissions, increasing carbon storage, and also helping farmers lessen or adapt to climate change, right? Because
when you say these practices, do you mean, well, what do you mean?
Oh, right. Yeah. So what I mean is things that farmers can do in terms of diversifying their crop rotations, planting cover crops. So a big conundrum, I guess, is that the plants that farmers grow, most of the cash crops, as they're called, because you sell them for cash, they're annual crops, because they are the ones that produce the biggest yield. So that's like soybeans, canola, winter wheat, corn. So they get planted every year, harvested every year. And for a good chunk of the year, the soil doesn't have any plants, right? And we know that diversity of plants is good for improving soil. It's like you don't want to eat the same thing every day. So the microbes also would like a diversity in terms of types of materials that get added. The one way to do that is to plant cover crops, because you can't diversify too much what you're growing, because you're you're limited as a farmer, you're limited by what the market is buying, right? So one way to diversify is to once you harvest, or even when the plants are still standing, your main crop is to plant a mixture of plants grown for the purpose of just improving the soil. They're not harvested, they're left in the soil. And then as they decay, they add carbon to the soil, they feed the microorganisms. So that's one practice that has shown potential, and a lot more farmers are starting to use them because they
That's
also.
a key thing in what you call regenerative agriculture now, right?
Yes,
That's
yeah.
a common term for it that I'm hearing now, right?
Yes.
Okay, there are a couple of practices that I'd like to ask you about specifically. Now let's go back to the animals, because one of the things that I'm interested in, and Mitloner didn't quite agree, but didn't quite disagree. So I'm not sure where you're going to be headed with this, but I'm interested in the argument of this guy, Alan Savory, and his holistic management approach, which claims that really we need animals, we need herds of animals, but we need ruminant animals, but we need them to be herded in a very specific way. So because they're essential to maintain the fertility of the soil. Otherwise you get desertification, which is going on all around the world. And that by in the old days, herds of animals moved around as a group because there were predators that would eat the periphery, and so they were safer in a bunch. But this meant that they would move around and they would leave their droppings and their urine, and they would just a period of days, and then they'd move to the next spot, and so on, and wouldn't come back until this first spot had recovered. And this trampling of the soil and loosening it and leaving the fertilizers of the manure is what has maintained the fertility of the soil. And I know that people arguing for the restoration of the prairies and the desire to bring back long grasses with long roots that sequestered tremendous amount of carbon in the soil when they had bison herds and so on. They are working with some of the same ideas, that animals are not, you shouldn't eat them all because we need their service to maintain the soil. How much of that would you buy into?
Well, so I haven't done research in this area, so I think that's often is called like rotational grazing.
Right.
And there is, I'm at the sidelines of that, and I've heard there is a lot of controversy as to how much carbon these practices can sequester. I do think that integrating livestock in the landscape has benefits, and a lot of farmers, even the cash crop farmers that I'm describing, are more diversified in the sense like of not just depending on one thing, which would be your cash crops, but would also have animals, and often graze the animals on the cover crops, like not a lot of them, but they are looking at some sort of innovative ways of integrating animals in the landscape. And the ones I know, they really are positive about the impacts on both their yields and the soil. I haven't done direct research, but to me, that does make a lot of sense, which then means like going forward, it's not about, I think people are often after simple solutions, right? Okay, let's get rid of the cows, we solve the problem.
We become all vegans and that's it, no problem.
Yeah, and I don't, it's never that simple. I think, and regenerative agriculture is a term that's been, it's not new, but is being used more now. There's more interest. And I think one of the principles is that it's very context dependent as well. So depending on what kind of farm you have, what kind of soil, you try to make sort of the best use of what the underlying conditions are. And then you use the principles of not disturbing the soil, keeping roots in the ground year round, integrating livestock. I think, did I miss one? Just not disturbing. Anyway, so those are some of the, and some of the practices that do that are, for example, cover crops, no tillage, diversifying your crop rotation. So not just relying on corn and soybeans, but, and there are a lot of interesting grains that people are growing in these areas. But again, to do that large scale, there has to be, more buy-in, I think, and as well support for farmers, because the farmers that are doing these innovative things, they do it because they're just experimenters by nature. They're curious, right? They try things out, but they do stand out in the sense of being innovative, but also within the community, where everybody's on the lookout. If they fail, they kind of go, oh yeah, like that person was fooled to try that, right? But they do it despite all of that because they have an internal drive to do it. While just like in any other aspect, there's a group that is risk averse, that will just continue doing the things how we've always done it. But we're not going to make a difference if we only have those 10% or 5% that are the innovators, right? We need to have widespread adoption. And for that, you need support in one way or another. It's either through the market or government. The shift is not going to happen by itself in a way.
You're saying it's not happening even much at all so far.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have a lot of contact with farmers, but they're the ones that are interested in the research, right? So they're not representative of everything that goes on. So slowly there is a shift. So for example, cover crop use, I think the numbers were, they increased from 5% to 14% over maybe a 5-year period in the land adoption in the landscape. That's it's moving in the right direction. But how do, the next group of farmers are the harder ones, right? Like as you have more, it's like with the vaccines, like as you have more and more, the last.
Well, now tell me about rice, because so much of Asia depends on eating white, polished rice, and it's not good for them, but it also is really bad as a source of methane.
Yeah.
So what is there as an alternative? Has anybody come up with any solution to that?
So I'm definitely not a rice expert. So I'm just going to like a few things from the top of my head. I mean, rice production, the reason it's the paddy rice that results in the methane. So any methane is produced in areas where we have lots of water and little oxygen. So the paddy rice that's submerged and methane is produced during that process. I have heard that there are some ways to manage the rice in terms of draining it and then flooding that minimizes methane production. And, like the trade-off probably is that if you don't grow it as flooded rice, if you grow upland rice, that your yields are less, right? So there's always these trade-offs. Do we So I don't think we can completely eliminate it. Just like with nitrous oxide, it's produced, it's kind of a natural cycle, but we can minimize it by managing the nitrogen better. So with
Yeah,
paddy
I want to come
rice,
back to the nitrogen in a minute, but
Mhm.
in terms of the general potential of regenerative agriculture to solve the climate crisis, what fraction of it could, how much hope should we pin on agriculture? I mean, I've been told that, I believe the French had something called 4 per 1,000 as a kind of an ambitious target that every farmer should try to increase the content of the carbon in the soil by 4, not percent, but 4 per 1,000 every year. And that if you did that, I don't know how much benefit we'd get, but it would at least for a while make a big difference. I've also heard that there's a limit to how much the soil can absorb. It's sort of like it gets saturated. That's probably not the word for it, but that you can't just endlessly sock away more and more carbon. So it's a good place to work right now, but it's not the be and of all. But I've also heard people talk about biochar, because that is limitless, I gather. You can just keep on making biochar and putting it underground or even on top of the ground forever. And basically it contains the carbon as much as you put there, and it'll stay there for 1,000 years or 2,000 years. And it's supposedly a good amendment to replace some fertilizer. Although it's not a fertilizer, it helps the soil retain water and minerals and other nutrients that make it a better soil for farming. That's a lot of questions in one in one paragraph, but answer all of them, please.
Yeah, so I think what in general, like agriculture can help offset some emissions and perhaps move towards being like net zero. But there are a lot of buts in that for that to happen. And I think it's definitely something that can help us with a transition, because some of these practices could be implemented right away, but and perhaps not cost as much or provide as much of a disruption to our system in terms of completely removing fossil fuel, which, you know, like everything, our systems are so based on carbon that to completely go cold turkey from where we are now to where we need to be is not going to work. But if people look at their individual carbon footprint, and I think it was this morning that there was a number of graphs in the Financial Post about that. Yes, your food choices are important, but how about all the other things that you can do in terms of overconsumption of driving and flying, and just the excess that we have in our lives in terms of clothes you buy, and like, so I think for people like me working in agriculture, the attention to agriculture is good in the sense that we're trying to raise awareness and improving. You know, we all need to eat, and the healthier the agricultural landscape is, the better, if in a number of issues. So we want, and it's difficult for farmers to do it on their own. So I think having the public's attention and interest is great. But to me, I sometimes find it's also a bit of a distraction, in the sense that, you know, you look at what we're doing individually and we say, okay, yeah, I can change the way I eat, but I'm going to not worry about all the other things that I'm doing that are contributing to this problem. And that's not how, the way forward. And I didn't answer your question about biochar. I have heard a lot about biochar, but I do not know, it's not a practice that is used on farms. And I'm not sure, I mean, I can imagine a lot of bottlenecks, to get this to be practical at the farm scale, which doesn't mean it's not worthwhile studying and figuring those bottlenecks. But
I did a talk show with Johannes Lehmann a week or two ago, who is the main person who specializes in studying biochar. And he had qualifications on it too, but it still sounds to me like it would be a big, if we could find the right source material to use. And really the problem is to create a market for it. I would think if we required by law that, say, 10% of all fertilizer be biochar, something like that, which would create an immediate market for it, then there are a lot of places where we could get the carbon-based material, organic material, to make into a biochar. Well, let me move onto fertilizer now, because you're covering all of the topics that are of special interest to me lately. I had a conversation, as I say, yesterday with an organic farmer and with your colleague Ralph Martin about using fertilizers. And I know that organic farmers don't, but the question to me then is, I understand that organic farming is maybe healthier, and it's certainly better for the soil, and you can keep it up indefinitely. It's not going to deplete the fertility of the soil, but it doesn't produce quite as much food per acre as the kind of agriculture we're doing now. Whereas our human population is certainly going to hit, I think, 9 billion, and it may get to 10 billion before the thing turns around. So we're going to have more food. Now, I've been told that about 50% of the food in the world is here because of fertilizer. How much of that is chemical fertilizers? I don't know. But of course, the organic, if everybody used organic, it would be, we wouldn't need any chemical fertilizers. But I'm thinking, can we cut back on fertilizer? Because the fertilizer is apparently causing huge environmental problems itself in the way of eutrophication of lakes and rivers and so on. And then even in the oceans, it has a negative, overall negative effect. So we don't want a fertilizer, but we need it. So there's a dilemma. Now, I just came across something a month or so ago, and I'll be doing a talk show with these people in Berkeley, California. I think it's called either Bio Pivot or Pivot Bio. I can't remember which. And what they have done is trying to find a way to reduce the amount of nitrogen fertilizers that are required. And they say that of course, as you've pointed out, the bacteria in the soil produce nitrogen, and these bacteria have sensors that apparently, when there's plenty of nitrogen there, they shut off. They say that's enough, and we'll take a rest. But these folks have found a way to turn off the sensors, so the bacteria will keep on producing nitrogen, I guess, endlessly. And what they're doing now is coating the seeds with this chemical or whatever it is that turns off the sensors. And then later, if they need to come back and squirt a little bit more of this stuff in around the plants, they do so that the bacteria of the soil will just keep on making nitrogen, and you don't need, or you won't need as much nitrogen fertilizer. Well, the question, a number of questions about that before I talk to these people in a week or two. One is, I understand that fertilizers contain not only nitrogen, but also potassium and phosphorus and some trace minerals. That, and the question is, what are you going to do if you cut off the nitrogen, but don't these plants also need these other things
Right.
that the bacteria would not be providing for them? And so maybe that isn't a solution. The other one is people like Ralph Martin say, well, what if you get these things going forever, just keeping on, you're then polluting the soil with excess nitrogen if you don't have any way of turning this thing off. So that's one of the questions that occurs to me. Is something like that, if we could manage it and turn them on and off, would this be a desirable solution to the problem of being, flooded with flooding the world with all this nitrogen fertilizer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so certainly. So I'll start with the beginning of your question, where I think it's close to 50% of the population currently alive is due to the Haber-Bosch nitrogen, due to the Haber-Bosch process. So that is the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer.
Mm-hmm.
So and that has resulted, like, that's the positive side, and then has resulted in a number of environmental problems. And nitrogen is sort of a really complex problem in a sense, because it's related to climate change, ozone destruction, eutrophication, decrease in biodiversity, and reduced air quality. So it is really, and the majority of the nitrogen is used in agriculture. So but we needed to grow food, as you started, right? So we need to come up with better ways of harnessing the nitrogen. Like, we are bathed in nitrogen gas. 70% of the atmosphere is nitrogen gas, and there's also a good pool of nitrogen in the soil, although we have to be careful because that is associated with the carbon that's stored there. So if we mine that too much, we can also impact how much carbon is being stored. Mm-hmm. But some of these very sort of front of the line research involving plant, microbe, soil interactions are really fascinating. And I hope that we get a number of solutions out of that research. So there's the fact that, there are plants that, like legumes, that are in a symbiotic relationship with bacteria that are able to harness the nitrogen from the atmosphere. Can we incorporate some of those characteristics into other plants that are non-legume, like corn and winter wheat? There's lots of work going on, and in Brazil, there was some work on that in sugarcane. I actually don't know where they are in terms of the using that in sugarcane production yet, but and then the other way is what you're talking about, this on-off switch, which I don't know about that research, but that would be one way to make some of that nitrogen available to plants, because the nitrogen in the soil is mostly in an organic form. So that's like dead microbes, live microbes, plant parts, root parts that are residue in the soil. But the plants need what we call mineral nitrogen. They need nitrogen in a form that is accessible, that's not organic. So they're probably working on, I'm imagining, that sort of conversion. That's, if you don't apply any inorganic fertilizer, that will be the source of nitrogen for plants growing, like either manure or legumes. As they decompose, the next crop can take that up. That's what is done in organic systems. I think even the name comes from that, because it's using organic sources. Now, part of your question was about other nutrients, right? Phosphorus, potassium, and again, like it's relying sort of more on the biology and organic sources, but they do have to in organic systems. They sometimes bring in, if it's rock derived, that's fine. They can use that. So that involves mining somewhere, right?
But there's plenty of it, right?
Yes, yeah.
There's enough of this kind of rock that if you quite, but that is itself requires a lot of energy to collect and smash,
Yes.
transport and sprinkle the rock,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, so I'm not in principle against synthetic sources. I just think that we need to be much more judicious as to how we use it. And we can, the positive part is that you can tailor it more to the time when the plants need it, while the organic cycle is much more difficult to control. But there has been overuse, and that's why we're in this problem, right? Like overuse or use at the wrong time. So managing fertilizer better and looking at some of these innovative, great ideas that scientists are working on, including, I've recently seen a paper where they've come up with a wheat that the plant roots exudate what's called a nitrification inhibitor. So that's gets a little technical, but it's basically part of the nitrogen cycle is the conversion of ammonium ions to nitrate ions. And nitrate is very susceptible to loss, to groundwater, to production of nitrous oxide. So if we keep it in the ammonium form, the nitrogen, it's better. And these plants exude an inhibitor that will keep the nitrogen in the form that the plants need it. So again, that's like, if we had that applied in a widespread scale, it would make a huge, huge difference.
Would it? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, okay. So now that's the handling the nitrogen part of the equation, but what's left over? There's a lot of other stuff in fertilizers, right? And are there solutions to potential solutions to both the potassium and the phosphorus questions?
Well, both the potassium and the phosphorus, they're not, sorry, I guess I don't know a lot about potassium and nitrogen potassium and phosphorus fertilizer. I do know that there, particularly on the phosphorus side, there are also issues like that contributes to eutrophication. Are there solutions in terms of replacing them at the field scale? It's a matter of recycling nutrients, right? So it kind of goes back to my initial comment on this, that one of the problems is the way we as people are organized in the landscape, where we have all the people in the cities and all the production in the field, and then those nutrients are taken to the city, they feed people, they end up in waste and biosolids. And then to make that back to the field, there are a lot of issues, right? Because all the things that end up in our wastewater, There is recycling of biosolids, but it is not that widespread. So that is kind of a fundamental problem that I'm not quite sure if we can completely solve, which then means that in the long run, we always have to have some kind of, replacement of those nutrients that have moved to the cities.
Yes, I have a friend, Laura Kahn, who's written a book about antibiotics and the soil. Of course, the antibiotics were badly misused too, being fed to animals to fatten them and so on. But she is interested in the fact that when an animal excretes out in the pasture and it's been fed antibiotics, that those antibiotics get into the soil and kill the very bacteria that we want to have functioning. So I guess, one of the real questions for me is how serious a kind of a problem is that? Do we have to worry about whether or not we're actually destroying the fertility of the soil by killing bacteria that we don't mean to kill this way?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's not something that I know much about. I do work a lot with a soil microbial ecologist, and now we haven't done comparisons between manure that had antibiotic fed and not, but there is, I don't think we've seen any evidence of that, but this is just a kind of a hunch.
You have, I looked at your website and there were some photos of you and your graduate students out in the field someplace, and you have big circles, round things, and then I don't know what you're doing there. What is the experimentation that you're doing with these big, what they look like about 4 or 5 feet in diameter and like a concrete tube or something?
Yeah, I do have to go in a bit, but yeah, they're called soil isometers. They're about 1 meter across at the top and 1.5 meters deep, and they're fully instrumented. Oh yes, I have to go. Sorry, I'm just seeing the car that's coming to pick me up. Sorry to cut it short, but. Okay.
I'll filter this out because it's a question that you can't take the time to answer. So go have a good day.
Nice talking to you.
I've enjoyed this very much. Okay, bye.
Me too. Bye.